Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in this morning. I hope you've all enjoyed your breakfast and had a good journey here. So just by way of a quick introduction, my name's Jen Williams. I'm the Managing Director at Secarma. We're located on a stand just behind the theatre over there if you do want to come and speak to us afterwards. So just a little bit about us and why we're here today. So we have quite a large background in IoT. We're a cybersecurity consultancy, but we're a penetration testing business. We've won a number of IoT hackathons, including Black Hat in Las Vegas. Can tell you now that was a great trip. We're an IoT certification body for the IASME scheme. So you'll notice that we're located next to IASME on the stand. We're really close partners. We have a number of IoT specialist testers within the business. And our expertise really is in helping SMEs, but also we work with a number of major high street banks and businesses of that size. We also, as part from the tech side of the business, we also have a compliance and assurance team. And that's, I suppose, some of the material that I wanted to talk to you about today. So firstly, from me, massive congratulations to all of the manufacturers and the distributors for achieving PSTI compliance before the enforcement deadline, which was the 29th of April this year. I know that must have been really difficult, but yeah, well done for all of your efforts towards that. Now, I imagine this is going to elicit a number of responses. There's going to be people in the room who sat there thinking, yeah, I did that. Yeah, that was great. There's going to be some people who think, actually, I have no idea what she's on about. And there's going to be others who think, I've heard a little bit about that, but I don't really think that applies to us. So for those people who think I have no idea what she's on about, so the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act is now enforceable. It's now in law, and it applies to connected devices that could be possibly sold to a consumer. Now, I receive a lot of questions from manufacturers who say, well, actually, our product is for businesses. We don't intend to sell to consumers. And actually, that bit's not important. You have to decide whether a consumer could possibly buy your product. So even though the average person isn't going to install your, key swipe entry system into their house, you might get that one eccentric person who wants to access control the rooms for the kids, and they may be able to get hold of your product directly. If that is the case, then this piece of legislation applies to that product. As I said, there was a grace period for implementation. That grace period ended on the 29th of April, and there are obligations on both manufacturers and distributors. So distributors have to make sure that they're not selling non-compliant devices, and manufacturers obviously have to make sure that their devices are compliant with the legislation. Again, this may elicit a response similar to this. Oh gosh, golly goodness, I didn't know about that. I didn't know we had to comply with this legislation. What on earth do I do now? The deadline's passed, I'm late. Step one, panic, wave your arms in the air. Then you can stop that part. Come and speak to us on the stand. So come and speak to myself, Luke Griffiths, who's also an IoT expert, or Jason Blake, who's just joined us in the room from IASME, who actually run the certification scheme. He's also a PSTI expert. He's got a massive grin on his face now because I've just embarrassed him. And if you do nothing else, get started now. So the enforcement body OPSS have said to us that if manufacturers are actively working towards compliance now, even though it's late, they'll look upon that more favourably than manufacturers and distributors who still got their head in the sand thinking, I don't know about this, or I don't know what to do about it. So start that process now. Now, this talk is entitled Moving On from PSTI, because I'm going to assume that the manufacturers in the room have already got that covered, distributors have already got that covered. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what to do next. Now, the reason I wanted to do that was because we've helped a number of organisations over the past year certify their devices in preparation for not just PSTI, but things like achieving Secure by Design accreditation or meeting the controls that are in the Cyber Resilience Act. And actually, when we've spoken to them, we've discovered that, yes, they may have considered their product security, but securing the business has been something that's been, I suppose, a little bit ignored. And actually, you can have the most secure product in the world, but if the infrastructure behind it and the business that runs it, including the people within it, leave you with security gaps, you've got just as much of a problem as if you have an insecure device. And security is huge. It's massive. So just to pick out some kind of key areas, yes, you've got your product. Underneath that, you're likely to have cloud services. You might have some physical or virtual infrastructure, and you're definitely going to be collecting some data. You've then got your business processes. You've got probably the hardest thing to secure in the business, which is the people that work for you. You've probably got a huge supply chain. There's been, countless media stories over the last kind of 5 to 10 years of quite catastrophic cyber attacks that have happened as a result of an insecurity within the supply chain. And sadly, it's often not the supplier who takes the flak. Think about the British Airways attack. Nobody remembers that British Airways web developer caused a data breach. They remember that British Airways had a data breach. So you can actually be compromised and your reputation damaged by your supply chain if you're not carefully managing it. You've also got compliance activities. So I've just mentioned a piece of legislation that will apply to manufacturers and distributors of connected devices. You've also got existing legislation like GDPR and other industry-specific areas. You've then got your application security as well. So all of the code that gets written into your apps and the firmware that, essentially runs your service. So it can get quite large and messy. So if I was going to give you a tip, I would say choose a framework. Choose a really well-established security framework that helps you to organize your efforts. Security can get really expensive really quickly. And if you're not guided by some kind of established framework, you can end up throwing a lot of money at areas that maybe don't quite make the most sense for your business. So these are the 3 frameworks that I often recommend to businesses who don't already have one. And the reason I recommend these is because they're well established, they're well understood, they're well documented, there's plenty of information out there, and consultancy services to support you if you haven't already started. So for me, the best for startups and beginners, and by startups I mean smaller businesses who maybe have not got huge security budgets. By beginners, I mean any size of business who are sat here now thinking, oh God, I haven't got a framework. Where do I start? Cyber Essentials is a great place to start. Now, I understand that it has its critics, and yes, it's it can be quite a narrow framework, but actually that's why it works. It's prescriptive, and it's supposed to cover just the basics of cybersecurity. So it focuses on the technical elements of your infrastructure and your really basic cyber hygiene, things like access control, having a secure boundary. So if you don't already have a framework, that's a great place to start. If you already hold that certificate, or you have some kind of, you do have those controls already in place, for that kind of intermediate level, I would suggest looking at the National Cybersecurity Centre's Cyber Assessment Framework. Now, there's no certification available for that, although there are services like maturity assessments that can score you against it, but that framework is a lot more comprehensive than Cyber Essentials and starts to look at other areas of the business, such as risk management, HR security, supply chain. The weakness for me and the bit it doesn't cover is in software development, which is where, ISO 27001 probably has an advantage. Now, again, 27001 has its critics, but for me, it's the most comprehensive framework for making sure that you've addressed all of your, security requirements within the business. And I like it because it's fundamentally based on having board level support for security. You can't run a secure business without that. And it's based around the risk that your business holds individually. So Cyber essentials, you have to put in the same controls no matter what size or type of organisation you are. ISO 27001 allows you to take a risk-based approach where you can say, okay, actually, we only have one supplier, so our supply chain risk is maybe quite small. So we're going to focus our energy on software development because actually that's what we do most of, and that's where our biggest risk is. So it's a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more flexible. You can get certified against it. There are a number of certification bodies out there. There are plenty of consultancy services out there. So I think it's a really good one for, maturing the security controls. So I want to move on now to some kind of practical steps that you can take to secure your business. And also want to give you some kind of real examples of, questions that we're asked all the time during the process of working with businesses to improve their security, and just share some of the thinking that we have and some of the recommendations that we give. And I'm going to do this in a journey that I think you guys will be familiar with. I'm going to do it through the production process. Okay, so pre-production, there are 3 steps for me here. Number 1, make sure that you've got your business security in place. Without that, essentially, you're building a house on top of weak foundations. If you do this part at the beginning, before you've kind of developed anything or written anything or designed anything, you're going to have better processes than if you retrofit this. Threat modeling. Threat modeling for any application or system development for me is a no-brainer. And I'll move on to what threat modeling is. But also up front, before you've done anything, make sure you review the guidance that's already out there, the legislative guidance, the stuff that's coming out of the EU around the Cyber Resilience Act. Make sure that you read all of that before you start designing. Again, I'll harp on about this a lot, but it's so much easier to do that up front than to try and retrofit controls. Okay, so what do I mean by securing the business? These are some of the key points. So I'm talking about securing your endpoints, making sure that your device security is up to scratch. So things like making sure you're only working on supported version of operating systems, making sure your cloud infrastructure is secure. The number of clients that come to me and say, no, my security is good because everything's in Azure and it's all secure by default. And then you take a quick look and actually those defaults have either been switched off, or actually the bits they think are defaults aren't defaults and need toggling on somewhere. So it can be the smallest little things, but unless you know about them, you wouldn't think to check. Make sure that you're securing your people processes. I can't stress enough how important this is. I work with a major broadcaster that have had, significant amounts of data being exfiltrated recently through disgruntled staff. Make sure your HR processes are up to scratch. Make sure your access control policies are there and that you know who's got access to what systems. People quite often will accumulate elevated permissions by moving job roles if you've not got a good process for closing off those permissions and re-provisioning them in their new roles. Make sure that your awareness training's up to date. Not everybody is security savvy, and believe it or not, phishing attacks are still one of the top causes of business compromises. But not just phishing. Think about things like how to travel securely. How many times have you heard conversations on a train where actually you could piece together all of that data and probably guess their password? I once had a similar experience with 2 guys sat opposite me on a table. I'd just been to InfoSec, so I was all in my Secarma security wear, and they were having a conversation where they disclosed their wives' birthdays, who they played golf with, where they worked, which site. They then turned to me and said, where have you been? I was like, I've been at a security conference. And they say, I bet you get to see all kinds when you do hacking. And my response was actually, I learn more about people and businesses through train conversations. And they went, oh, and carried on. So yeah, that kind of thing happens all the time. Make sure you know what data the business holds. Use a good categorization system. I'm a firm believer in not over-securing things that actually don't present a risk and not under-securing the pieces of data that actually do pose a risk. So make sure you know where your crown jewels are. Make sure you have a good data loss prevention policy. So the business I work with, where their disgruntled employees have been exfiltrating data, had they had DLP policies in place, either in their cloud service or even manually in some cases, then they would have prevented a lot of that from happening, and they would have saved a lot of money in the cleanup of having to go and retrieve this data. A little bit about threat modeling. Now, this is one of the areas that I'm quite passionate that developers and manufacturers really take on board, because I think not only does it give you a security benefit, but it actually gives you a design benefit and a business benefit in terms of costs. So threat modeling is essentially a tabletop exercise that you conduct once you've done a design, but before you've actually written a single line of code. And it involves all of your techies and all of your people that know the product inside out and how it's going to work. And it helps you to spot design flaws and detect problems early, which then allows you to focus testing once the product's been developed. You can actually remediate a lot of problems before any release, and it's actually, as I'm sure you'll understand, a lot cheaper to solve a problem in design phase than it is to go back and fix things once it's already in production. So if you've not done any threat modeling exercises, or you think I'd like to know a bit more about that, come and see us. We can talk about threat modeling, and we've done exercises where we've actually trained developers on how to threat model. So it's an area that we know quite well. Make sure that you're reviewing the guidance out there. Highly recommend reading this document. Lots of the other legislation that's been considered worldwide is based on this standard. So the more you know this, the more you can use it in your threat modeling activities, and you can use it to make a better product that actually you don't then go and have to retrofit controls when, let's say, another market introduces legislation. As part of your development processes, make sure that you have secure development policies. I'm still encountering manufacturers who are globally known, who have great products, but actually they're not using secure development policies. And it gets really expensive then, because you have two developers working in slightly different ways. One of them leaves. You don't know how anything's been done. You don't know where it's been kept. You don't know who's got access to the source code. You don't know what's been written into the source code. You don't know what kind of sanitation's going on in the inputs. Make sure that you have a really robust, secure development policy. And in a second, I'll come on to what kind of things that should contain. Make sure that we're doing these cloud configuration reviews. So there are standards and benchmarks out there for cloud services to be reviewed against. Even better, get a second set of eyes to do it for you, whether that be within your own business or whether that be a third party. Get somebody to double check that all those security features that you think exist in your cloud environment are actually turned on and working, and haven't been disabled by some other policy somewhere that's blocking it. That's a really common issue that we see. Okay, so secure development policies should contain the following elements as an absolute minimum. So make sure that you've defined acceptable tools and plugins. So what are we allowed to use, what are we not allowed to use? And then make sure that those tools and plugins have been tested. So, make sure that we've done some due diligence on those plugins, and at least we know who owns them, and at least we know where to go if there's a problem with it. Make sure there's some detail around source code management. So what needs to happen before a check-in? What needs to happen before a branch is created, so that we're not having kind of messy code everywhere. Again, I've seen examples in quite huge businesses where code has just been literally lifted off GitHub because the access control's not in place, or the right kind of code hasn't been checked in before somebody's left. So make sure you've got all those policies there. Make sure you've got a set of established authentication methods. You don't want to leave it to individuals to choose what authentication methods are going to be used. Define that in the policy and try where you can keep them consistent through the business. Make sure there are best practice guides. So let's say, you've done penetration testing on 6 of your services and they've come up with the same kind of vulnerability. Make sure that into your secure development policies, you put some controls around writing out that vulnerability. So, the amount of businesses that we test their applications and they still have SQL injection vulnerabilities, it's one of the most common things we find as pen testers. and it's a really simple one to write out. Those kind of things should be explicit in your policies. Make sure that you've got detail of any hardening techniques that need to be used, and make sure that you've already defined your testing methodologies. So I'm not saying you have to pen test everything, because as I've said before, I very much believe in a risk-based approach. So I believe that, vulnerability scanning on lower risk apps is completely fine, whereas your crown jewels you may want to have intensively tested. You might want to look at continual testing for, where you need maximum uptime as well. And then as part of your cloud configuration reviews, make sure, it's really basic, but make sure that you're reviewing access control. So where you can, use security groups to make that easier, but make sure that at all times you know who's got access to which pieces of data within the business. Make sure that the storage is configured securely. The amount of Amazon S3 buckets that are sat there open to the world, I can see people smiling because they know I'm going to say this already. It's a really common find for pen testers, and it's like, come on guys, this is really basic. Also make sure that things like encryption are configured correctly, and that you've defined what encryption methodology you're going to use within a business. It's so important, so that let's say your access control fails for whatever reason, or your storage configuration fails, that data is encrypted, so it's going to mean nothing to anybody anyway without those keys. And then post-production, now we're looking at things like compliance activities. So making sure that this device you're about to release onto the market is compliant with things like the PSTI Act. Make sure that it's been thoroughly tested, and make sure that you've got a methodology for ongoing vulnerability management. Now, for manufacturers that are just learning about PSTI now, and you've got hundreds of products that are sat in warehouses waiting to be installed into people's homes or put onto people's wrists, for example, if you already have a method of updating those devices, actually you can retrofit the PSTI requirements, because there's only one of them that needs to be done on the device itself. The others can be policy updates. So make sure you have a method for, remote updating and remote management. So the compliance part's really easy if the guidance was used from pre-production. So I'm going to give you some free consultancy here. So if you are one of those manufacturers that's thinking, gosh, didn't know about PSTI, my device is probably in scope, and you have a way of making sure that that device can have its password policy updated, you can fix this very quickly. You could fix this week, because actually the other two controls are around having a vulnerability management policy, and they're around making sure that you publish to the consumer how long your device will receive updates for. Okay, so you can retrofit those two controls. The manufacturers who've got devices without remote update capability, you're going to have a much more difficult time unless you've already got strong password management on those devices. Not saying it's impossible, I'm just going to say you've got a tougher time. Okay, penetration testing. What kind of testing can we do? So absolutely make sure we've tested the hardware and the application and the infrastructure that it sits on. Now, for cloud infrastructure, that may look like more of a config review than a pen test, because obviously Microsoft don't often give out permission to test certain services, but sometimes they do. Make sure that you've done both an authenticated test and an unauthenticated test. So an unauthenticated test looks at the device as if, a malicious outsider would look at it. So no information, we're just going to try and get into it and see what we can steal. An authenticated test is much more representative of that malicious insider, or even a malicious user if we're talking about devices. So, what can they see when they've got a set of credentials? Both are important. Again, use your risk-based approach. If your device actually doesn't give a logged-in user any additional privileges, then maybe worth just doing the unauthenticated test. When we talk about vulnerability management, I'm talking about having a methodology to be able to update these devices. So, if you're going to tell a consumer that they will receive 5 years of support on their video doorbell, Make sure you've got a method for updating those and a method for catching failures as well. Make sure that you're doing regular scanning and testing, and that you're actually collecting those results and actioning them. So there'd be nothing worse in the eyes of a regulator than a known vulnerability that wasn't fixed or wasn't able to be fixed. Make sure you've got a process, and this is in the PSTI requirements. Make sure you've got a process for users or customers of your device to be able to report vulnerabilities to you. So they may find them during the course of normal use, or you may get some kind of trainee hacker or script kiddie who's determined to break something. You have to have a process for the public to report vulnerabilities to you. You also have to publish your SLAs for fixing those vulnerabilities, which I know can be challenging, because actually, how do you know how long it's going to take to fix if you don't even know what it is? But there we go. The government knows best. And then make sure that you're, being part of the security community. So, you can get a lot of information by threat intelligence feeds. Look at what attackers are doing. Put yourself in their shoes using your device. What could they possibly do? If you can, join things like CIS. Look at the National Cybersecurity Centre's intelligence feeds as well. There are also industry groups that you can look at. So the IoT Security Foundation, and have a look at just general publications. But I suppose the point is, make sure that you're up to date with actually what's going on in the wild. Now, I'm sure I've said a lot of words that people have thought, I've no idea what that means, or they've thought, actually, I've never thought of that. I want to speak some more. Do come and speak to us. We're on stand F6. We're actually next door to IASME as well, who are also PSTI experts. But yeah, we staff our stands with consultants deliberately so that we can help to answer questions at events, because there's nothing more frustrating than hearing something in a talk, going to speak to the vendor, and then saying, oh yeah, we're all account managers. So yeah, we do staff our stand with people who know this stuff. So yeah, please do come and talk to us. We're a friendly bunch. We're very northern, so we speak funny, but we're a friendly bunch. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, guys. And yeah, happy to take any questions on the stand or after the presentation. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.